everybody join us as participants to the webinar. So just give it just a few seconds. We've got lots of people joining us today. And we're very excited to be talking about cybersecurity in supply chain. So just give it a couple of seconds as the participants join us, and we will get started.
Yeah, we're live.
Right. Awesome. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our jam-packed panel discussion today. We have a dynamic group of professionals from procurement, supply chain, and technology coming together to talk about all things cybersecurity, which is important for any industry, but even more important for global supply chains today. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey, and I am the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain, as well as the CEO of Ships, and I will be your moderator along with Michael Cadieux of Procurement Foundry. Mike, say hi to everybody.
Hey, everybody. How you doing? Good to see you all. I'm at Procurement Foundry headquarters here in the basement. I'm excited about this panel. I love cybersecurity, and I love supply chain. So these are two of my biggest topics right now. I'm really excited and stoked for this.
Awesome. Awesome. So a little bit of housekeeping. We will be taking questions throughout the discussion today, both in the Q&A function in the webinar, as well as live. Yes, that's right. We are streaming live to LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, you name it, and we're going to be monitoring that. So make sure that you drop a comment if you have any questions. We are going to be we're going to try to get to them throughout the discussion today, but we've got a lot to get to. So if we don't do that, we will be saving some of the questions for the end as well. So let's get to know our panelists today. Starting with Vicky, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and what is the biggest cybersecurity challenge the supply chain industry faces today?
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vicky, and I am one of the managing partners at Cloud Managed Networks. We are heavily focused on cloud-based security, and we've been in the technology business for over 20 years. And myself, I would say since I was 11 years old. Started programming for my uncle, making stocks and shares accounting programs with reporting and forecasting. So technology is in my DNA. I've loved it from the very beginning.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. So next, Ruth. Tell us who you are, what you do, and what you think the biggest challenge is.
Well, you know what? For 40 years, I've been going to cocktail parties and introducing myself as, hi, I'm Ruth. I'm an international freight forwarder. And everybody would say, what kind of forester? And I'd say, no, forwarder.
What kind of forester?
It's hilarious. It's hilarious. So today, there aren't any cocktail parties. And I introduced myself as a recovering forwarder. As I recently retired from the National Association, CIFA, I had the privilege of leading that association for about a dozen years, representing the international freight forwarder on both the domestic arena and in a global arena. So that's where I am today. And I think that was the second part of your question, Sarah. What do I think is the biggest challenge?
Yeah, the biggest cybersecurity challenge in supply chain.
Yeah, you know what? That's I think we'll talk about a lot over the afternoon, but just talking to forwarders over the last little while, partly in preparation for this discussion, I think the biggest challenge right now is everybody working at home, employees working at home on personal computers, on networked and shared devices. What kind of security do they have? What kind of password disciplines are they using? So it's a COVID challenge right now. But a lot of guys very, very suddenly, but like within a day or two, had people, 200 or 300 people going to work from home. So I would put that up as my, and they might not come back to the office. You know that? I think a lot of people are going to continue working from home. So I'm going to pick that as my number one challenge today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruth. We're really happy to have you here. Now, Stuart, tell us.
Yes, hi, my name is Stuart Pearson. I'm the Vice President of Contract Logistics with a company called Think Logistics, and we are a retail and e-commerce centric third-party logistics provider. I've got 25 odd years of experience in the supply chain space, and as Rob Lee can attest, I used to work with Rob at Ingram Micro. A large part of my time is spent on the IT side of things, helping refine the solutions that we provide, and challenging IT to come up with new ways to do things. In my role at Think Logistics, I'm responsible for business development, but I also have responsibility from a management perspective for our IT team. So it kind of gives me a bit of a unique perspective on things. On one hand, it's great because I can commit to a client that we can build something or do something. And on the other hand, at the end of the day, when there's RFPs and concerns about IT security, I can't just pay lip service to it. We got to make sure that we are putting our money where our mouth is.
Right.
So I think the biggest sort of threat right now in terms of IT security and cybersecurity in general is really just awareness. There's an interesting article last week, and I can't remember the firm, but an IT security firm themselves did some testing, and they found that 20% of the time their employees responded to phishing emails and granted access to things they shouldn't have. So I really believe that the creating that awareness, both in terms of the management team and making sure that there's investment and commitment to IT security and data security, but also getting the message down to every last user that has access to a web page or email platform is super important.
Huge one. And last but absolutely not least, Robert, tell us who you are, what you do, and what the biggest cybersecurity challenge is.
Yeah, hi there. I'm Robert. I'm the Director of IT for Ingram Micro Canada, taking care of all IT operations surrounding application development, partner integrations, and infrastructure and site support activities. One of the things that Stuart mentioned about Ingram Micro, we're the largest distributor of technology services and products in the world, right? And so I've been in the industry for about 20 years. Worked with Stuart for most of that period as well. But basically, I think the question about cybersecurity is an interesting one. I think there's a lot of different concerns that the panelists here would actually bring up. But one of the things that I'd be interested in understanding more so is the amount of investments that people are making within this area. I think whether that's truly enough or whether they truly understand what areas they want to focus on is probably a big concern.
That's huge. And also I would add to that liability, which I think we're going to get to in this discussion today. So I think we want to better understand the impact of this to supply chain, but also to the freight forwarding industry. And Ruth, so I'm going to start with you. You're a former director of CIFA, which is the Canadian International Freight Forwarding Association here in Canada. What are some of the changes you have been seeing in freight forwarding that are impacting the types of data that companies need to track, or maybe the way that they do business?
First of all, you have to understand, I've been in global logistics since before the fax machine. So there have been a lot of changes since before the fax machine.
I've been in it since typewriters. I mean,
yeah, well, I'm not saying. Who doesn't have an IBM Selectric hidden underneath their desk just to do an emergency airway bill? Just asking. But so we look at the kind of data and what changes we've seen. So there've been a lot of changes. A couple of things that I was thinking about, and number one, I really don't think that goods are moving faster than they did, say, 30 years ago. I still think, ocean freight is taking the time that ocean freight takes, and air freight, they maybe cut a few hours off, but it's still taking the same amount of time. But what has dramatically changed is the amount of data that we have to transmit now. And by we, I mean a forwarder. So today, and so one is the amount of data that we have to change and how fast we have to transmit it. So all the advanced security data that has to be transmitted to various governments around the world. So for example, for the Canada Border Services Agency on goods coming into Canada, they have an e-manifest program where you have to give them house bill data before the goods leave overseas on marine cargo, for example. And that's at the house bill level. So we have this really big spike up in the amount of data that we have to send and the speed with which it has to be transmitted. And it's, security data, it's customs data, it's all kinds of data, down to the part number detail. The other thing I think that has changed is customer expectations of information related to that data. So the forwarder has to send it to government agencies, has to provide it to carriers. We have to have all of those connections, all of those networks. Everybody's really still heavily invested, I think, in EDI transmission with all of our partners, be they carriers, airlines, or government. Using third parties to do that. But the other thing that's significant change, I think, is the cargo might not be moving faster, but customers' expectations of what they need to know, when they need to know it, where is the cargo, where at the part number detail, has certainly increased exponentially in the last 30 years.
Absolutely. So, well, and the data that we're transacting back and forth, not only just in the business internally for freight forwarders, but also the data that's going back and forth from customer to freight forwarder and vice versa.
Well, so the forwarder, the customer has to send the data to the forwarder, and the forwarder then has to send it out to all these government agencies and to all these carriers. So we're still getting data on paper. I say paper, but it's like scanned data. We get a commercial invoice that's scanned. We have to retype that. And I'm a big type it once and share it with everybody. I can't stand rekeying. I was the ISO queen at Fritz companies for several years, and data entry was one of the big things. But so this information and all these data bits are going from a customer to a forwarder to a carrier, from a customer to a forwarder to a regulatory agency,
Well, and it's all competitive too, right? And it's all, and that I think is the biggest point here. So I'm gonna move it over to Robert, because I want to talk about it from a shipper standpoint, an Ingram Micro standpoint. What are some of the concerns you have at Ingram Micro about all the data you are collecting and keeping in the cloud, including some of your clients' data?
I mean, that's a great question. I think probably the most common fear that many would have is still around data security. Trusting someone else with your data continues to be a focus point. That, and to be honest, prevents companies from transitioning to a cloud environment. All the advancements that we've made and the learnings around that, especially around data leakages or even the hacks that have happened over the course of the months and the years, security has to play a huge role in its ongoing efforts to mitigate all those risks. Things like encrypting data, to using different authentication models, to even securing the transmission of data for the inputs and outputs. There has to be some investments for that, right? And it's not only for the sole responsibility of the cloud provider, but it has to do with actually the companies that want to move forward with that type of cloud environment as well. So some of the concerns from my side when we start talking about cloud infrastructure and cloud environments was really more primarily around the accessibility and availability of the data that's being stored. From an IT perspective, and especially from my side, we want to be able to get access to that data as soon as possible. This on-demand, as needed, is a big concern, and whether or not the environments themselves are able to fulfill that is some of the things that we need to be aware of. Everybody wants to have that 100% high availability, 99.99% availability in place, but that in itself takes investment, right? And things like what cloud providers provide in terms of redundancy, CPU bandwidth, scalability on demand, that's going to ensure that the availability is there for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a follow up to that, what do you, in your estimation, what do you think is the percentage of other organizations that share the same concerns? Like, is this something that comes up in your world a lot?
It does, and the answer probably varies from which sector we're talking about, right? But if we're speaking generally, I would say that a high percentage of organizations would also share these same concerns. Today, we know that there's roughly about anywhere from 45 to 50% of companies and corporations that implemented some type of cloud environment, from a backup perspective to hosting applications that involve like a sales cycle or financial solutions. But what that means then is that the other 50 plus percent haven't, right? And the question is why, right? And that's probably is in part some of the concerns that that we talked about, but possibly others, right? And we talked about scalability, we talked about availability, but there could be things in terms of just fear itself. Losing control over data that they once owned and controlled, and having it managed elsewhere is probably something that they need to think about. And especially, there's always a cost factor. Whenever we deal with corporations, cost is a big factor in everything that we do, right? And so I think it's a combination of all those things that basically provides that concern that they might have.
Absolutely. Mike, I know you said you had a question. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. I've been chomping at the bit over here ever since you started talking about it. So quick question for Robert. You talked about the fact that one of the biggest problems today in data security associated with the supply chain is probably underinvestment, right? Yeah. Do you, and you're in a unique position with that at Ingram where you're an aggregated seller of technology solutions, right? Is there a percentage that you think, or that Ingram thinks, that that the under subscription basis is? I mean, how much more could people be spending than they're spending right now on security? And I'll second that up with a second part question, which is, a lot of supply chain folks that are responsible for supply chain systems, at least in my opinion, aren't necessarily directly associated with the legacy IT teams. So where do you find the chief information security officer, and how do you broach that relationship between the CISO's office and the supply chain management office, so that they understand exactly what the risk mitigation theories out there?
Yeah, and that's great questions. I think from my perspective, those conversations are probably easy to have, especially when a risk is identified and have happened to the company that's impacted. That in itself sparks the conversations of, why did it happen, and what are we doing to recover, and what do we need to do to respond to that?
Yeah.
I think overall, especially coming from my industry, the investments is a journey, to be honest, right? It's not a quick fix. Let's put some budget together. Let's implement one fix and then be done with it. That is not the right mindset. The security practices that I think most corporations are going to go and figure out is, this is a journey. This is a roadmap exercise with them. Right? We're talking about years in terms of putting the investment in to put the right measures in place. I could tell you specifically from an Ingram standpoint, we're following a framework called, that's solely based on that NIST CSF framework that the U.S. implemented some time ago, back in 2014, right? And the core categories and the functions around NIST is around identifying kind of what the risks are. That type deals with like asset management and governance and risk assessment. The other category then goes into protection. What kind of access controls are we putting in place? Data security, protective technologies. The detection category talks about, monitoring continuously, right? Having the right detection policies and processes in place so that we can prevent things like fraud from happening.
Right.
The category then becomes into our respond category, where we have to communicate. We got to figure out what the mitigation plans are and what improvements can we put in place so that incidents don't happen again. And then the last category is about the recovery category, and ultimately, all that improvement in terms of incident management to underlying where the faults could lie, those are all things that, in terms of investment cycle, needs to be put in place. Yeah. And so, when companies start thinking about, well, is it my time to put in a framework to deal with it? I would tell you that most companies probably started it, right? In terms of how they authenticate through to their own networks and devices. There is some type of security measure that allows them to do that. Now, whether that's enough, that's the question, right? And so hackers are becoming.
And that's. I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but that's why companies need companies like Vicky's, right? That's why people need subject matter expertise. They need to be able to say, hey, listen, this is a constantly moving and evolving target here. The threat is both external on malware and ransomware companies and hackers, and people want to tell you that your shipment got delivered 3 weeks ago and it actually got put on a truck and went somewhere else, right? I used to be in the fish business, and a lot of stuff went off campus real quick in the seafood industry. But at the same time, you've got internal threats as well, right, Vicky? So you gotta manage the both of them.
Oh yes, I'm waiting for my questions to pop up, and I can get into great detail. If everybody noticed, I'm the only one who did not say what is one of the biggest threats in the industry, because where do I even start? And I don't think we have more than an hour right now, so we'll get to it. But yes, there are a lot of things that one needs to consider.
That's why people are bringing you in, right? Because you're the subject matter expert, and you can stay on top of this for companies, right?
And you'll be very surprised that internal threats are way more. We say threat, but the issues that arise from within your network are way more than outside.
Oh yeah.
Statistically.
Yep.
Interesting. Well, and I think we're going to get to that in just a minute, but I think I want to get to Stuart real quickly before we dive right into all of that, because you're a VP of a logistics company, and data and IT and technology has been creeping into the industry, right? We've been forced into it from a freight standpoint, and I can say we because I spent 20 years in that sector. Do they know a lot about their liability and how they need to be prepared from that risk mitigation standpoint that Robert was talking about?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, from the companies I interact with, and I have a unique kind of position in the market because we're not an Ingram Micro in terms of being super large, and we're not a mom and pop operator. We're kind of in that middle size and growing. And what I've noticed is that the larger organizations, whether it be on the vendor side or the larger carriers or the larger 3PLs, they're pretty aware of their risks. They're pretty aware of have well-established, information security policies. And as Robert said correctly, they're working on that continuum, and they're very far along that process. It seems to me to be the smaller, cartage carriers and smaller freight forwarders and smaller vendors and even customers. If you think about what Shopify and a lot of internet retail has been able to do in terms of democratizing retail, a lot of these organizations just haven't thought through their liability, their obligations, whether it be things like personal information with Pepita, or really designing their processes in a way that makes sure there isn't a from what I see, it's really largely size, and then it doesn't have to be. I mean, kind of
is it me or is it Stuart?
Yeah, Stuart, your
breaking up.
Audio is breaking up a little bit.
Uh-oh.
I think it should be okay now. Try again.
Sorry. Okay.
There we go.
I guess what I was going to say was that when it comes to medium-sized companies, we've found that utilizing experts like Vicky and utilizing the Azure platform or other cloud platforms goes a long way to helping achieve compliance without having to make some of the really large infrastructure investments that are otherwise needed.
Yeah, which is really important. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think we've really realized in the past as forwarders and logistics companies the magnitude of data that we actually keep on behalf of our customers. So I guess that, in my mind, is something that we should be concerned about. What are some of the other things that they should be concerned about that might not be on their radar right now?
It's really just you've covered a key point, which is making sure that the data is encrypted both in transport and at rest. You can do those things relatively easily and with low cost, and those things alone go a long way to protecting that digital asset. The other side of the coin, I think, is really thinking through the supply chain in terms of who are all the partners. Like in our world, for example, when we ship something, we're handing data to carriers. They themselves may be handing that data to partners, especially given how rural a lot of Canada is. And really, understanding where there are gaps, I suppose, upstream and downstream is pretty important when you look at data security from a supply chain perspective.
Absolutely. And now, Vicky, I'm going to come to you because we already have an audience questions that's asking for examples. So I'm going to skip through the IMO and we can get to that a little bit later. But some of the issues we're hearing a lot about in mainstream media are websites being held for ransom, companies being hacked, like the attack on Maersk in June 2017. That cost over $200 million. So, I mean, from the conversation that we've already had about, on not only securing the data, but just from a pure cost perspective, like that's huge. And I know you guys have another example of a major milk aggregator and how they were like the downtime and the recovery and all that. Can you talk to us and run us through that example of how it affected them, how it affected their supply chains, and what you guys did to help with that?
In fact, I can give you more examples than that as well.
Sure.
There are two words that people don't understand and don't realize: backup, recovery. They're two different words, And they're two different processes, and they don't usually go hand in hand, which some of us have learned the hard way. So when security is nobody's problem till it becomes your problem. And it's nowadays, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, if you're not on top of things. And especially in supply chain and also in manufacturing as well. One of our clients, and the one you mentioned as well, when something breaks down in your organization in terms of ransomware, it starts crawling through your organization. And it's very interesting that these ransomware applications can lie dormant for months or even years.
Yeah.
So when you're running your backups, you're actually backing up your ransomware as well at the same time. And then when it actually hits, when it has propagated enough and stayed under the radar in your organization, it will wipe out all your systems. It will wipe out everything that you have and encrypt everything that you have, from order processing, delivery, shipping, tracking, customer information, absolutely every department. And when we go in, it's like deer in headlights. And one of the meetings that I recently actually sat in as well, for a similar situation, when I got an SOS call at 8 o'clock in the morning, nobody knew where to start,
Right.
including us. Where do you start?
Mhm.
What do you start looking at? And a manufacturing company that was actually hit with ransomware, they did not have the budget to secure their network. The budget to secure the network, believe it or not, was only $25,000. They did not have that budget. A week or 2 weeks after we had finally exhausted that conversation, they got hit by ransomware. The budget came up really quickly. Even before we invoiced them, the budget came up for cybersecurity. However, it took over a week to get them back online at a cost of $60,000 per hour, because they are part of just-in-time manufacturing. So they have just-in-time manufacturing deals to fulfill and obligations, because it goes down the chain. If I cannot make that part, it doesn't get delivered and just trickles downhill. So security it's a mindset. It's not something that you can take care of right now and say, okay, I'm done. The bad guys, as we put it, are one step ahead. And security in our world today is just a catch-up game at the end of the day. All we are doing is mitigating new risks that come up. The bad guys are way ahead of us. So can we put a security measure in place and say, okay, we are done for the next year? No, we cannot. And I did not answer that question at the beginning, which you did open with and say, what do you think is one of the biggest risks in cybersecurity? I don't even know where to start.
Right.
I'm thinking, okay, is it the employees clicking on a phishing email? Is it that somebody's not paying attention to your Wi-Fi network credentials? Is it your firewall not updated? Is it a server which is somewhere that has not? Where do I start? It's all of them. Do you have two-factor authentication? Where does one start? So it is a mindset, and it does have to start with, if I was to say, where do we start? We start with employee education. And what we do is we encourage our customers, and in fact, we at times even do it at no charge if we are engaged for a long period of time. The little webinars that we do for the employees of the organization is done on a regular basis, maybe once a month or maybe once in 2 months, where we actually show them, this is what a phishing email looks like. This is what you're looking for. It looks very legitimate, but this is what you can do. And I'll give you guys a tip, whoever's listening in. When you say, oh, your Netflix password or your Netflix account is not working, one of those usual ones, hover your mouse over that link, or right-click on that link and say copy link. Go to Notepad or Word or anything and paste it. And if you look at it, it has nothing to do with Netflix. It will be www.adpqt.something. And you see it has nothing whatsoever. So that's a very quick way. And I clicked on one. It was harmless. It came through my... It didn't do anything because I use very secure servers, but it was we just changed over to Outlook 365 from another exchange, and it said Vicky be at Cloud Managed, and I never get phishing emails on Vicky be at Cloud Managed. And it said that, and I actually sent out an email to 4 recipients, and it said that it's delayed. I'm like, why is it delayed? Click here to remedy the situation. And I clicked, and I'm like, oh,
So it happens to the best of us.
It happens to the
Bummer.
best of us. It happens to the best of us. But fortunately, my browser will catch that. If it's supposed to be something and it's not what it's supposed to be, it will catch that, and it will actually pause and say, "Not happening. Are you sure this is what you want to do?"
Yeah.
But that's because I'm paranoid, and because I've seen things. I've seen the way these applications work. So hover your mouse over it. If you do not see the link, essentially just click on it.
And you're absolutely right, because in supply chain, if something goes down, and Stuart knows this, Ruth knows this, I'm sure Robert knows this as well, it's affecting everything upstream and downstream. And, if you've got a shipment that you need to get out and your systems are down, what's your customer going to do? Right? They're going to go to somebody else. So that's even just a cost of business.
Absolutely.
Robert, do you have anything to add on to what Vicky had to say? I know you have a large organization that, potentially could fall victim to some of those phishing or those scam emails or different things like that.
Yeah, I think, from a company perspective, we've implemented those things that Vicky just mentioned, right? I think the awareness is top of mind. The attempts and the practice in terms of understanding what is a phishing email look like, what does a phishing text message looks like coming from your cell phones. And, quite honestly, I think as companies engage more with users and their personal devices, and, people have implemented bring your own device to work that have company type information on those devices, that becomes an issue as well, right? In terms of how and what they're looking at. And so, the two-factor authentication that, Vicky talked about, and probably doesn't even just stop there, right? I mean, I think overall, this is where the investment cycles of understanding where do we want our end state to look like. We could even put in place, biometrics where we do face recognition, right, on top of MFA, and does that give us that end state that we're looking for? Quite possibly, right? But overall, from a supply chain factor, I mean, I think Ruth talked about a little bit about the amount of data that's being transferred back and forth. If you think about how interconnected we are in the supply chain, everything from our vendors shipping us products to the distributors within that shipping products out to our customers ordering it. Each one of those pieces has a data input somewhere. And in this day and age, real-time data and on-demand data is prevalent. As users expect more, and especially as we get into this same-day delivery cycle that, has been manifested over the course of a couple of years, it's us understanding within the supply chain, how do we then get that information back outbound to our users so that they're informed of where the package resides, right? It's become even more, relevant to protect that data, right? And I would tell you that technologies that are forthcoming in terms of AI, blockchain, and IoT devices, those all have to take in place in terms of what those new security requirements could be, right? And more so, as more devices get connected, as more things get interconnected, we have to make sure that that data is protected somehow.
Absolutely. Mike?
Yeah, I think Robert hit it on the head for me. Probably one of the things that I was thinking about, and I was recently with a very large manufacturing firm based out of Europe, is they're about to turn on all of their IoT that they've been embedding into all of their products and services that they're now shipping around the world. And those IoT are going to be, pinging networks and wireless networks on boats and inside of, containers. And I think that I guess my biggest concern is that I think there's a perfect storm here inside a supply chain. And Vicky, tell me if I'm off base here or not. You've got a kind of a legacy industry in supply chain with legacy systems per se, right? And legacy software systems. I know the airline industry still book on a piece of software that's about 60 years old right now, right?
Sabre.
Yeah, Sabre. I think so. Sabre was written in a language that's like, Egyptian Sanskrit. It's not even a computer language anymore, which is.
I used it.
Yeah,
I programmed on it. Don't ask.
It's the same software that ATMs run on, right? And so you get this perfect storm of an industry that doesn't really adopt technology and change very quickly. They're running on legacy systems. Then everything seems to be moving to the cloud, which is what your newer data systems are. And now you've got a younger generation of kids who are digital natives versus digital tourists, like we all are, I think. And they're expecting things to be cloud-based. And then you get into a situation where, God forbid, you have a cloud provider that you're relying on and they get taken down or they get exposure. It just seems to be it's a really, really kind of a perfect storm for brewing cybersecurity threat, right?
From an IoT perspective that you mentioned, I find that very interesting because we are also quite heavily involved with Ingram specifically. Ingram is our only distribution that we use. We are very loyal as a company. So we, as you would know, we get approached by a lot of them, but we don't. However, IoT is something we are very involved in as well with Ingram. And I'll just throw this question out there. And obviously, it's not interactive, so you cannot answer. But think about this, everybody who's on the call. If I was to ask you in your home Wi-Fi network and your home network, internet network, how many devices do you think you have online? Can anybody answer that question for me accurately as of right now? I bet you cannot.
No, I don't think
exactly.
I'm in the high 20s, probably low 30s.
I'll bet you're higher than that.
So if I was, okay, I'm at 175, FYI.
Yeah, I bet you're at 50 to 100. My refrigerator's on my Wi-Fi now.
All right.
But you said 50 to 100. The key point over here is if I'm sitting in your driveway right now, sniffing packets, which is where IoT goes, and looking at the data going back and forth between a wireless device, would you ever know? If I was to find a device on the IoT network, on your IoT network that is not patched and doesn't have the latest updates, and if I get an entry into your system from that and start planting things, do you know that? Once again, yes, IoT is good, technology is moving, and it's a good direction it's moving in. But you have to put checks and balances in place to know exactly what it is that you're using. And are you actually monitoring the inventory of your inventory?
Yeah.
In other words, I have kind of 50 to 100 IoT sensors on the docks in my shipping containers. Like, is it 50? Is it or 100? Or is it 55? So if I sneak one in and it's on the same frequency and I somehow manage to get onto your network, would you know I did? So with adopting new technologies, do you have the checks and balances to know what's on that network?
Yeah.
Well,
what's on your network?
Yeah, that was one of my questions. Is everybody's talking about implementing technology, but what are they doing to protect themselves? What are they doing to protect the additional data and things that are coming in with that technology and the upstream and the downstream of that? So that's a really great point. Sorry, Ruth, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Well, I know there's been a whole bunch of really interesting conversations, and we talk about the IoT. I mean, we're talking smart containers. Not only do we know going to know what's in the container and where it is and what temperature it's at, but somebody could go in and change the temperature of that container if we don't have the right security built around it. And so for freight forwarders, we're all in this transition period right now because we have to be sort of at the leading edge of this technology so that we can serve our customers who expect to have these data. And a lot of guys are using it now, but it's still pretty manual, I think. They're putting GPS locators into containers or onto skids or into cargo. But I think when we ramp up in the near future, it's going to be a real area of cyber risk, I think. Cybersecurity, I mean, the neat thing is we can do it now and we can tell when a shipment stops moving, when it shouldn't stop moving, right? So if you got a shipment that should be moving and it's not moving and you get an alert to that because it's being tracked with a device, you can take steps on that. And we had one example of a container that was at Heathrow, and it was supposed to be refrigerated, and they noticed that it didn't move for an hour, and it had been sitting on, as an air freight shipment, had been sitting on the ramp by accident for an hour. And then so they made physical phone calls and said, hey, airline, get this container moving. And so they moved it. And then they were also tracking the temperature, and they tracked the temperature, and the temperature went down and down and down and down and down and got to like 2 degrees. And they phoned the airline back and said, take it out of the freaking freezer and put it back in the refrigerator, would you? It's like, but all of these data are out there, and they're so much rife with opportunity. I mean,
well, and I think on one hand, you're saying that like the technology is great to be able to keep a handle on the temperature controls, especially in those instances. But then on the other hand, we're also talking about that being hacked and potentially somebody hacking in there and turning it up and down. Vicky?
So I want to weigh in on this, and that's a very interesting thing you mentioned, Ruth, about the tracking of the containers and it's not moving. Well, how many times do we get something that we call in our industry a false positive, where it's actually moving, but because of some communication issue, it's showing that it's not moving. And that leads to a problem of, do I start ignoring them? When I start getting false positives, and now we start ignoring, and actually, I do know of IT people who actually ignore it, thinking it's probably a false positive because it's supposed to be moving, so it's probably moving, which goes to on a whole different thing of, do you have appropriate, adequate monitoring and IT staff? So it just keeps growing. It's the mindset keeps growing that it's not a simple thing that one or a company needs to do. It's a mindset. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't have to cost millions and billions of dollars, but it has to be a mindset, and you have to be mindful of all the moving parts in it.
Yeah. Stuart, I want to bring you in here. You've been kind of quiet. So I want to bring you in because we've spoken about a lot. I know one of the questions that I wanted to pose to you are your customers asking these questions?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen an uptick in the last number of years with clients that are prioritizing IT security. I mean, 5 years ago, you might get a few questions. Interestingly, when we get, requests to provide proposals to some larger organizations and notable ones that have actually experienced, data breaches or security incidents, it's interesting how much of a blow-up effect there is on their procurement process. And I'm sure Michael can speak to that. But, where IT security maybe wasn't a top concern before, it's up there and typically now one of the largest sections of procurement, documents when it comes to things that we'd engage in. So it's great because if you're able to respond to those things and you have the tools in place, it's challenging, I'm sure, for those organizations that don't have the resources in place.
Yeah, really, really good point. Mike, did you want to jump in on that one?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the first thing I'm thinking about in all of this, from a straight procurement perspective, is a couple of things. One is just thinking from a terms and conditions inside of a logistics contract, right? And a logistics software contract or a system. Number one, my biggest concern is, are the emerging high-powered logistics systems and cloud-based systems, are they making enough coverage in their liability clauses to be able to cover the possibility of them having a breach, right? Which there's a theory out there that the entire SaaS industry is one breach away from losing all their funding, and the entire VC industry is going to go find something else to do because Lloyd's of London isn't underwriting, cybersecurity threat and breaches for more than $2 million until we figure out where the hell this whole thing's going, right? Even though, as Vicky said, a lot of the breaches are internal. There's somebody clicks on a fish or you got a disgruntled employee. I think 70 to 80% of breaches these days are internal versus external, right? But at the same time, my other concern, and I'm shocked that nobody in the panel, we've got 50, 60 people watching this thing, not including what's out in cyber, and nobody's talking about, and I don't know if this is true or not, and maybe somebody can tell me this. Does the GDPR issue associated with personally identifiable information translate into the supply chain? Because for me, the number one issue right now with liability is GDPR. And I'm wondering if that translates, because everybody in the United States is adopting GDPR like Europe. So from a risk management perspective, is that even a thing here when you're talking? I mean, I understand we're talking about freights and containers. And by the way, I've had one of those containers that was supposed to be at 42 degrees and went to 90 in Busan. It's not a good thing when you ship fish internationally. But I'll stick with my GDPR question. So is GDPR a play here or no?
Yeah, I could probably add to that. Shipping internationally and or shipping for U.S. companies that deal internationally. We've had to comply with GDPR. We've had to make changes into our process. Create APIs where data can be removed on request. So it's very much a thing that logistics companies need to be aware of and addressing. But what we found is if you've got a good foundation in place in terms of encrypting data that's being transferred, encrypting data in the database, and you're taking the broader steps to manage information, the actual the impact of GDPR isn't that great. So
I mean, I wouldn't have thought about that a long time ago, but now I've got a 17-year-old kid 2 floors up inside of my house right now who's probably searching on Alibaba for about 50 t-shirts for his Fortnite buddies, and he's getting them shipped in from overseas, and it's getting put into a container or an air cargo hold that has my and my son's personally identifiable information attached to a label somewhere. And now all of a sudden, you've just immediately crossed that line. Now there's personally identifiable information associated with that. Now all of a sudden you're in hyper risk mode, and your liability, which is unprecedented and hasn't been worked out in a court somewhere in London yet, is a serious problem, right?
Mike, I think oh, sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
So I was just going to say, I think the huge spike in e-commerce that we started to see, with the 2017 Christmas spike, that e-commerce, individual shipments going to individuals who are being paid for with individual credit card data, they're not corporate. I mean, a lot of supply chain has always been corporate movement. So it's commercial data.
Right.
And it's important and it's commercial. But now I think all of us are handling, certainly freight forwarders are handling hundreds and thousands of e-commerce individual shipments and transmitting or sharing those data. So I think that's been a significant change in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and something we need to keep an eye on. Vicky?
I'm not an expert on GDPR, but my personally identifiable information, from my perspective, the way we look at it, is information that I can use to actually transact business from a banking monetary perspective. In other words, if I can look at that shipping label and I can go to a bank and get a loan under your name, then it is considered personally identifiable information. But there's hardly much damage that can be done by just a name and an address. Hence, banks, other financial institutions are much more, they need a lot more information, like they would need your social insurance number, your driver, something a lot more than just a name and address, and a lot less damage can be done with just a name and address. Most conditions or situations where you could potentially get some damage requires more information.
Yeah. I'm also concerned about all the people that are working in the supply chain embedded inside of companies. You've got, Jane Doe at, I'll just use wayfair.com, right? And you're buying something, and now Jane Doe's been putting in orders and shipping them around. Now Jane Doe leaves Wayfair or wherever she's working, and she wants all of her information stripped out of all of those systems. And it's like, if you can't strip her name and her information out of those systems, you've got a problem.
And interestingly, Mike, on the other side of that, Jane Doe is working for Wayfair. She leaves, but she's had personal identification with suppliers, with carriers. And so let's say she's really annoyed, she's really ticked off, she leaves your company, but she can still access your company data, perhaps, through her old Wayfair connections. So if that's becoming, for the freight forwarders, it's becoming an area where you just have to watch what your relationship with carriers, for example.
By the way, I do not want to get a cease and desist from Wayfair. I'm just using the name.
Sorry,
I apologize in advance.
ABC.com. ABC.com.
Any company employer. How's that? I'll just leave it.
All right.
Yes.
So
ABC.
before we get into some tangibles, I just want to bring up something that Eric Valaquette, he's joined our webinar as an attendee. He says, sharing information, trusting information, monitoring information, visibility. I might be biased, but I'm hearing from the conversation so far that blockchain related technologies might help in some of these areas. I didn't have this in my list of questions. It's a great question, Eric. So I want to ask you guys, why is adoption so slow? Who wants to take that one? Robert?
Maybe I can start. I think blockchain as a newer technology, it's hard to imagine kind of what that might evolve into. I think overall, as blockchain was first invested in terms of just currency exchange, using cryptocurrency as an example, that evolution in terms of spanning across the money sector, but more in terms of supply chain now, has become more truer than ever before. I think overall, the supply chain in terms of how it implements a blockchain, and really, when you look at blockchain, it's not just one technology. It's what I consider stackable technology, right? Because you just can't just have a blockchain, right? You got to stack it with things like AI, machine learning, and things of that nature to make it more effective, right? And this is where the interconnection of how companies interact, especially within the supply chain with vendors and our partners, becomes even more prevalent. I think as information gets stored in a blockchain, there could be things that within the chain that could be transmitted back outbound. And that's the on-demand data that they have a need for, right? And so, yeah, blockchain can suffice the data transmissions or the inputs and outputs quite easily and quite securely, right? As these hashes that they're so-called get inputted into a blockchain, those hashes are basically probably really difficult to unbreak, like to break, right? To deliver that hash back inbound to say, hey, I figured it out. Let me grab that data now, that piece of data, and figure out what to do with it. That becomes very difficult and time consuming, right? And so, I think that's where the evolution of technology is going to expand to, right? And I think blockchain itself is just so new. There are probably thousands of people that heard about it, probably millions. But in terms of implementing it from a business standpoint, end-to-end solution, probably still is pretty much infants in terms of solution design.
Yeah,
Robert,
sorry, go ahead.
Just adding to what Robert said, it's mainly does somebody want to deal with it? It's so new and it's so involved with so many different moving parts and layers that one needs to add on to it, that companies might just say, you know what, we'll get to that. That's for the next quarter, not right now, or the next fiscal.
Absolutely. So I want to get. Sorry,
I think the biggest, just 2 seconds. The biggest problem with blockchain that I see so far is not being able to get the entire supply chain to agree to the blockchain, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have it from, raw material basis through sub-manufacturing, through sub-assembly, through shipping, through port, and customs, and in now regional shipping and warehousing, and.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody has to agree that, number one, we're going to work on this one chain altogether, because now there's 400 chains. I mean, we could probably start a chain together right now if we wanted to before this meeting ends. And then you also need to worry about getting everybody in the supply chain to agree to actually keep up with that stuff, on top of the fact that there's just reams and reams of still physical data, like Ruth said, but reams of digital data too, right? So that's, in my opinion, the biggest incumbent to blockchain right now. It's just the hurdle of how do you get everybody to agree to start rowing the boat down the aisle the same way.
Yeah. Again, from my perspective, Mike, it's not just a single technology, and there's not a single ownership of that technology.
No.
You're right. Every player that comes into that blockchain has a piece of it, right? So they all have to buy in terms of what the inputs are, what the outputs are going to be, so that their cycle is sufficient, right? And I think that's where the challenge is getting all the buy-in to say, what are the benefits for me doing this with you? Right. And I think that's got to be realized sooner than later.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes, and I want to get to some tangible takeaways. So I'm gonna throw some of this out to you, Vicky, and you, Robert. So what is the likelihood that companies are going to get hacked? And if they do get hacked, what do they need to do to get back up and running very quickly? Vicky, I'm going to throw that to you.
What is the possibility of a company getting hacked, just on a general term?
Yeah.
Very high. Like I said in the beginning, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Things are changing very, very rapidly, and the security landscape today is vastly and very, very different, exponentially different than what it was 2 years ago. It has grown, it has multiplied, and it has become very, very sophisticated. Quick thing, and I don't know who's watched one of James Bond's movies, when the new Q, I think, was introduced, when he said that I can do more damage in my pajamas in the morning before my first cup of Earl Grey than you can do in the field with a gun in a month. That is very, very true. And actually, just across from me in my office, I have a hacking field kit that we often use to strengthen and protect our network. So we run these tests routinely, at least once a week, to see where are the flaws and how we can fix them, because then we can educate our clients and partners on it as well. So what they must do, I would say that at the very least, a company should speak to companies like ourselves. Whether you actually implement that or not, you're at least aware of what to look out for, small things that you can look out for, small things you should be aware of. So you do have an idea of what's happening. The same question I asked, does anybody know accurately how many devices are on their home networks today? I bet you nobody does. And I'm sure at least 50% don't know how to even find that information. So if there is your neighbors on your Wi-Fi, you would never know. So by that token, at least be aware, at least start talking, at least be knowledgeable about what's happening and what you should be looking out for, and start having those conversations. And perhaps, if I would say best case scenario, start implementing a plan, even a phase plan. Maybe you don't have the budget for it right now, but what does that even look like? Educate yourselves.
Absolutely. Now, before we get to the last one, I want to ask you a question from Pratim. Do you think if the stakeholders across the supply chain use similar IT platforms, if not the same, it's less challenging to ensure data security? I mean, I guess in this question, are we going to get there? I mean, and what does that look like?
I think we are going to get there. If that question was for me, was that for me, Sarah?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say definitely. Working from home was not a norm earlier, but we were forced to. So circumstances might come down to that being a requirement. When there are enough breaches, when there's enough chaos, when there's enough little pieces down the supply chain that keep going down that are causing hassles to one of the bigger players, a bigger player might come and say, okay, listen, I understand you don't have the budget, but I'm going to help you. I'm going to put systems in place, because technology is becoming more affordable. Things which cost hundreds of thousands earlier are not that expensive. I will invest in that because I know my investment of whatever, $50,000, I'm going to get a huge ROI very, very soon. So to answer that question, absolutely. And that would definitely mitigate the risk tremendously.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So the last one is, what would be your recommendation to the supply chain community when thinking about cybersecurity? Let's end off with that, because I think that that's a really important question. Like, what can people do moving forward as they're thinking about cybersecurity to really ensure that they're not only securing their own business, but also their customers' business? Robert, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to end off with Vicky.
Wow. I mean, I don't know if there's just one. I think the panelists will probably all agree that there's probably multiple. This, right. And I think just going through a list, I mean, it's just strong passwords is key, right? Making sure your antivirus software is up to date, strengthening your home network. Vicky talked about that. I have 2 children. I think Mike talked about the people upstairs and what they're doing in terms of Alibaba, but you should talk about it, about the internet, with our children, and let them understand kind of the risks out there, so that they're protecting things like social media accounts, understanding that they shouldn't be transmitting information outbound, especially when to people that they don't know, right? And I think so long as we don't get caught off guard, I think that's something that we should all be aware about.
Yeah. Vicky, or did Stuart or Ruth want to jump in there before I go to Vicky?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'll tell you, if there's forwarders on the call, forwarders come in all sizes. There's big, sophisticated organizations, and then there are lots of smaller, medium-sized companies. Don't wait until you have to react.
Right.
Act now. Act now. Get a security audit. Have somebody come in and tell you where your weak points are. I mean, we did it at the association 18 months ago, just as I was leaving and Bruce was coming in. Oh, who knew that there were all those weaknesses in these sophisticated? So my really quick takeaway is, don't wait until you have to react. Like Maersk, MSC, Costco, they had to react. So
$200 million. I think that's all we have to say.
300.
Right?
It was like, yeah, they're very expensive. So, and education. The guys I talked to are they're doing regular training on phishing, ransomware, what to do, steps to take. So those are my two. Those are my 2 takeaways.
Good one, Stuart. Real quick before I get to Vicky.
Yeah, just to build on what Ruth and Rob said, there are lots of things that can be done. Engaging a company like Vicky's, putting in a firewall, whether it be a Meraki or Ubiquity. I mean, there's some technology now that's quite low cost, but very capable of providing value, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money.
Awesome. Now, Vicky, what do you think people should do?
I said I've said enough, but I'll say 3 things. Be aware, make a plan, and at the very least, if you can, implement 2-factor authentication for yourself, your family, and your employees. It's very simple. It's not hard, and Google Authenticator offers it for free for most websites for 2-factor authentication.
Wow, that's great. You told us to hover over a link and now you've given us that. I
We'll
mean,
attend
that's
together.
amazing. Amazing, amazing.
Too cool.
So don't leave your business unprotected as our new normal finds more online. We need to make sure our businesses, supply chains, and customers' data is protected more than any other time in history. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today in the webinar and live. Remember to register for our one-day virtual supply chain conference coming up on June 25th. Cloud Managed will be back for a 30-minute lunch and learn at that event. So bring your thoughts on this topic and any questions that you may have. So join us there. You can register at procurementfoundry.com. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us. And thank you to Cloud Managed for putting this together. Visit them at cloudmanaged.ca.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.